The door burst open before the wind could finish its work, and she was inside, soaked through, her shawl plastered to her shoulders, her boots leaving dark prints on the plank floor. Rain hammered the roof like fists demanding entry. She turned, dropped the wooden bar across the door with hands that would not quite steady, and pressed her back against it, as though the storm itself might follow her in. He stood by the hearth, a coffee cup forgotten in his hand, staring at the woman who had never once, in all the months they had shared a boundary line, crossed onto his land without being asked. Lightning threw her shadow long across the far wall. Thunder rolled behind it, so close the window panes trembled in their frames. "The barn," she said, breathless. "I couldn't hold the door. The wind took it clean off its hinges and I—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened, the way it always did when she caught herself saying more than she intended. He set the cup down. "Your animals." Inside. Latched the stall gates twice over. She wiped rain from her face with the back of her wrist, and for a moment, the fierce composure she wore like armor slipped, just at the edges. "I couldn't stay there alone." Not tonight. It was not an admission she made lightly. He knew that much about her, even in the short time they'd been neighbors. Knew it the way a man learns the shape of a fence line by walking it in the dark. She did not ask for shelter. She did not ask for anything. The wind found some seam in the log wall and screamed through it. She flinched, just slightly, and glanced toward the window as if the storm might peer back at her. "You're safe here," he said, because it seemed the only true thing he had to offer. She looked at him then, really looked, water still dripping from the hem of her dress onto the floorboards he'd cut and fitted himself the winter before. Something crossed her face, not quite gratitude, not quite surrender, but close enough to both that it startled him. "I feel safer with you," she said, so quietly he almost lost it beneath the thunder. The words hung there between them, unadorned, offered without flourish, and neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed. The fire popped in the hearth, rain lashed the shutters, and for one suspended moment, two people who had spent a season guarding their words and their land stood in the same small room, neither retreating. It had not always been so simple a distance to cross. Long before the storm found her at his door, there had been fences mended in silence, greetings exchanged with more caution than warmth, and two homesteads sitting side by side like strangers who happened to share a well-worn path between them. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his father on the rise above the creek, in ground still soft from spring thaw, and in that time he had learned the particular silence of a house with only one man's bootsteps in it. He rose before light out of habit rather than need, fed the stock, mended what broke, and spoke to no one for days at a stretch except the mare he'd raised from a foal. It was not loneliness exactly, though he supposed a stranger looking in might have called it that. It was simply the shape his life had taken, the way a fence line takes the shape of the land it follows. She had come to the homestead west of his not long after, inheriting her father's smaller cabin, his well, his stubborn patch of garden, and his reputation for keeping to herself. He had known her father a little, enough to nod to at the mill, enough to trade seed corn once or twice, but he had not known her, not really, beyond the fact that she managed alone and did not seem to want help managing. So he had offered none, beyond what courtesy required. He mended the shared fence when it needed mending, and left word at her gate rather than knock upon her door. She returned the kindness in kind, sending back butter or a measure of flour when the season allowed, never more, never less. Their exchanges were brief and correct, weather remarked upon, crops discussed, nothing risked. If their eyes met across the pasture some evenings, they held only long enough to be polite before finding some other, safer thing to look at: the horizon, the cattle, the darkening sky. He had told himself this was simply how neighbors on the frontier ought to be: careful, self-sufficient, unwilling to lean where leaning wasn't wanted. He suspected she told herself something similar. There was a kind of respect in it, he thought. Two people content to let the other keep their own counsel. And yet there had been moments, small and unremarked, when he'd caught himself watching the smoke rise from her chimney of an evening and wondering, briefly, what her supper table looked like, whether she ate alone as he did, whether the silence in her cabin pressed on her the way his did on him. He never let the wondering go further than that. It seemed a kind of trespass, to want to know more than a neighbor was owed. Now she stood dripping in his front room, having crossed that careful distance in a single desperate run through the rain, and said a thing neither courtesy nor caution could have prepared him to hear. He set down the towel he'd been holding out to her, unused, and reminded himself that a man did not stare at a woman simply because she'd said something unguarded in a storm. He busied his hands instead, laying another log on the fire, though the fire hardly needed it. That, too, was a kind of trespass avoided, giving his hands work so his eyes wouldn't wander toward her face to see whether she regretted the words already. She had not regretted them yet, at least not visibly. But he knew her well enough, in the distant way a man knows a neighbor he has watched for 2 years, to expect the regret would come. She was not a woman who admitted need easily. Since her father passed the winter before last, she had run that homestead the way she ran everything, alone, and fiercely proud of doing so. He had watched her string fence in weather that would have sent most men indoors, watched her haul water from her well with a straight back and a set jaw, watched her turn down offers of help from half the men in Silver Hollow with a politeness so firm it left no room for a second asking. He had learned, mostly, not to offer. And yet there had been small exceptions, moments neither of them spoke of afterward. Last spring, when her mare had gone lame near the shared fence line, she had let him look at the hoof, let him hold the animal steady while he worked out the stone wedged in the frog, and had said only, "I'd have managed," even as she watched his hands with something that wasn't quite gratitude, but wasn't far from it either. In autumn, when a section of her garden fence blew down in a hard wind, he had found it mended by the time he rode over to offer help. Mended, he suspected, with his own spare wire, taken without asking from the roll he kept looped over a post nearest her land. He'd said nothing about it. She'd said nothing about it. It had simply become one of those unacknowledged currents that ran between two adjoining properties, help given and taken in silence, as if naming it would somehow diminish it, or worse, obligate something neither of them was prepared to give. Now she stood in his front room, with rain still dripping from the hem of her skirt onto his floorboards, her arms wrapped tight across herself, looking as though she already wished to take the words back, or at least wished he would pretend he hadn't heard them clearly. Thunder rolled again outside, closer now, rattling the single window facing the yard, and she flinched, just slightly, before catching herself and straightening, as if daring the sky to make her flinch twice. "You're welcome to the fire," he said finally, keeping his voice as plain and unremarkable as he could make it. "Storm won't last the night." He did not know yet how wrong he was. The wind had been building since supper, though she hadn't thought much of it at first. Montana skies threw tantrums all summer and quieted just as fast. She'd banked her stove, checked the well cover, and gone out to the barn only because the mare had been pacing, ears back, the way animals did when they knew something before people did. That was when she'd heard it, a groan of timber overhead, low and splitting, followed by a crack sharp enough to make the mare rear against her rope. She'd looked up in time to see a section of the roof near the loft buckle inward, rain pouring through in a sudden silver sheet, straw and old shingle raining down onto the stall below. She'd hauled the mare loose before the beam gave further, dragging her out into the yard where the wind nearly tore the barn door from her hands. It was the creek that decided her after that. She'd gone to check it out of habit more than fear, and found it already climbing the bank in a way she had never seen it climb, brown and fast, and swallowing the low fence posts along the near pasture. Somewhere beneath that churning water, though she did not yet know it, the old boundary stone between her land and his was being scoured clean of a century's silt. She had stood there a long moment, rain running into her collar, telling herself she could manage, that she had managed alone before, through worse nights than this one. But the barn was open to the sky, the mare was trembling under a lean-to that would not hold if the wind turned, and there was no bridge crew, no neighbor closer than the one whose window she could see burning steady and yellow through the sheeting rain. She had not decided to run so much as found herself already running, skirts heavy and dragging, boots skidding in mud that had been solid ground that morning. The lightning had shown her the path more than her own eyes had, and when she'd reached his door and pounded on it with both fists, she had not planned the words that came out of her, had not planned to say anything at all beyond asking for shelter for the mare, for herself, for whatever the storm meant to take next. Now, standing in the dry warmth of his cabin, the words she had spoken seemed to hang in the air between them still, though neither of them moved to acknowledge them again. He had only nodded, as if she had said something ordinary, and set about finding her a dry blanket while the wind threw itself against the log walls hard enough to rattle the single window. The mare would not settle. He had led her into the small lean-to attached to the barn earlier, but now, above the storm, they could hear her scream, the particular high sound of an animal that has decided the world is ending. Without a word, he was already reaching for his coat again, and she was reaching for hers, and neither of them suggested the other stay behind. Outside, the rain came sideways, stinging like thrown gravel. The barn door had torn loose from one hinge and swung wildly, striking the frame with a sound like a fist on wood. He caught it on the backswing, threw his shoulder against it, and shouted for her to find the rope coiled by the feed bins. She did, her hands sure despite the dark, and together they lashed the door fast to the post, working by feel more than sight, her fingers close enough to his that once they closed over the same knot at the same moment, and neither pulled away first. The mare had worked herself into the corner, eyes rolling white in the lightning flashes. Maeve went to her slow, murmuring low words that Daniel could not hear over the storm, but recognized anyway, the particular register people used with frightened animals, the one that asked for nothing and promised everything. The horse quieted enough to be blanketed, enough to stand still while the wind screamed past the gaps in the boards. Inside again, they discovered the water. It had come up through the floor of the root cellar first, a thin, dark line creeping toward the stacked barrels of salt pork and the sacks of flour that were the difference between a hard winter and a starving one. He swore under his breath, the first unguarded thing she had heard him say, and began hauling sacks up the cellar ladder two at a time. She followed without being asked, her arms full of jarred preserves, her skirt soaked black to the knee. They worked in a rhythm that required no discussion, stacking supplies on the higher shelves, bracing the door with the heavy oak bar he kept for winter storms, wedging rags along the sill where the wind found its way in. Somewhere in the labor her guarded composure had slipped, and his had too. She saw it in the way he glanced at her now, not measuring, not wary, but simply looking, the way a man looks at someone he has decided, for tonight at least, he trusts. Outside, the river kept rising, patient and indifferent, toward the bridge that stood between them and everything they thought they knew about their two separate lives. The rain stopped sometime near dawn, though he could not have said exactly when. He had fallen into a shallow half-sleep, sitting upright against the cellar door, the oak bar still braced beneath his palm, and it was the silence that woke him, the absence of the drumming on the roof, the absence of wind clawing at the shutters. He opened his eyes to gray light coming thin through the cabin windows, and to her asleep in the chair across from him, her head tipped against the wall, a jarred peach preserve still clutched loosely in one hand, as though she had meant to shelve it and simply stopped. He did not wake her right away. He rose quietly, stretched the ache from his back, and went to the door. What he saw when he opened it took the last of the night's exhaustion and replaced it with something colder. The yard was a ruin of mud and scattered branches, the kind of mess a man expected after a storm like that. But it was the sound that struck him first, or rather, the wrongness of it. Always before, from his porch, he could hear the river as a distant murmur, steady and familiar as a clock, ticking somewhere in another room. Now it was a roar, wide and swollen, closer than it had any right to be. He walked toward it without deciding to, his boots sinking in the soft ground, and stopped at the top of the bank where the old bridge had stood for as long as he could remember, the only crossing between his land, her land, and the town beyond. There was nothing there. Not broken planks, not a leaning post, not even the stone footings he half expected to find scoured bare. The river had taken all of it, swallowed it whole in the night, and carried it off toward country neither of them owned, leaving only brown water churning over the place where a road to Silver Hollow used to be. He heard her step up beside him before he heard her voice. She had wrapped his spare coat around her shoulders, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "It's gone," she said finally, as if she needed to hear the words spoken aloud to believe the sight in front of her. All of it. He kept his eyes on the water. No crossing this side of the ridge trail, and that won't be passable till the ground firms up. She was quiet, doing the same arithmetic he was. No bridge meant no town meant no supplies, no doctor if one were needed, no way to send word to anyone that they were stranded together on 200 acres of mud with whatever they had managed to save from the cellar the night before. "Then it seems," she said carefully, "we are neighbors in a way neither of us planned to be." He glanced at her, and something in her expression, not quite fear, not quite resignation, settled into his chest, like a stone finding its place in still water. They walked the bank in silence after that, taking stock of what the water had rearranged in a single night. A section of split-rail fence lay scattered like kindling 50 yards downstream from where it belonged. A stand of young cottonwoods had been stripped of half their branches, the wood raw and pale where the bark had peeled away. He noted these things the way he noted everything on the land, cataloging damage, already calculating what could be salvaged and what would need rebuilding from nothing. It was she who stopped first, her boot catching against something in the churned mud near the old fence line. She knelt, brushing wet earth away with her fingers, and he came to stand over her, waiting. "There's stone under here," she said. "A marker, maybe." He crouched beside her and helped clear away the silt until the shape of it became clear. A squared granite post, weathered gray, sunk deep enough that the flood had only uncovered its upper face. Carved into the stone, worn but legible, were two sets of initials and a line that ran between them like a boundary drawn in permanent ink. He recognized his father's mark at once. The other belonged, unmistakably, to hers. "That's not where the line runs," she said slowly, straightening up. "The line's 40 yards west of here, past the fence." "I know where the line runs," he said, though for the first time in his life he found himself uncertain of it. He had walked that boundary 100 times, had mended fence along it since he was a boy, following his father with a bucket of nails. But the marker sat squarely on ground he had always considered his, cutting into what should have been Callahan land by a fair margin, or perhaps cutting the other way, depending on how a man chose to read it. She crossed her arms over the borrowed coat. Maybe it's an old marker. Maybe they moved the fence after and never bothered pulling the stone. Maybe. He didn't believe it, not entirely, though he couldn't have said why. There was something deliberate in the way the initials sat side by side, something that didn't read like an accident of surveying, but like an intention someone had meant to preserve. She studied his face, and he saw the same quiet suspicion forming behind her eyes that had already taken root in his own chest. "Your father and mine," she said. "They knew each other. Everyone in this valley knew each other. That's not what I mean." She looked back down at the stone, at the two names cut into it decades before either of them had been old enough to understand what boundaries meant, or why a man might choose to blur one on purpose. "I mean, they knew each other well enough to put a marker where neither of our fences agree it belongs." Neither of them spoke again for a long moment. The river kept moving past them, indifferent, carrying away whatever answers might once have explained why two dead men had left something behind that neither of their children understood. A rider appeared on the far ridge just as they turned back toward the cabin, the sound of hoofbeats reaching them before the shape of the man did. He came down slow, picking his way around the standing water, and by the time he reached the yard, he had already introduced himself twice, once to the air, it seemed, practicing the words, before he said them properly to the two of them standing side by side near the barn. He was a surveyor, he explained, sent ahead of a rail company scouting a northern spur that might one day connect Silver Hollow to the larger lines threading east. He carried a leather case of maps, rolled tight as kindling, and he spread one across the tailgate of his wagon, with the careful reverence of a man who believed paper could settle what people could not. "The proposed route runs along the river," he said, tracing a line with his finger that passed close to where the stone had surfaced that morning. "Whichever property holds the higher ground here," he tapped the map twice, "stands to gain considerably. Right-of-way payments, station proximity, freight access. It could change a family's fortunes." He said it plainly, without malice, the way a man might describe weather rolling in from the west. But Daniel felt the words land like something colder than rain. "And the other property?" Maeve asked. The surveyor hesitated, not unkindly. "Land values tend to fall on the side that doesn't get the line. Buyers want proximity. It isn't fair, ma'am, but it's how these things go." He asked whether the boundary between their two claims had ever been formally resurveyed, and when neither of them answered right away, he glanced at the exposed marker stone half sunk in the mud a few yards off, its carved initials still catching the weak morning light. He didn't ask about it directly, but Daniel saw him note it, the way a man notes anything that might complicate a otherwise simple line on a map. "I'll need an answer within the month," the surveyor said, rolling his charts back into their case. Company won't wait past first snow. When he rode off, the silence he left behind felt heavier than before he arrived. Maeve stood very still, her arms crossed against the chill, staring at the muddy ground where the map had been spread. "If the line runs through your land," she said finally, "you could sell for more money than either of our fathers saw in their lifetimes. And if it runs through yours—" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both understood, without saying it, that whatever fragile trust they'd built over the last 2 days, the small kindnesses, the shared work, the quiet companionship of two people stranded together by weather, now stood beside a much colder, more practical truth, that a stranger with a rolled map could undo in one afternoon what a flood, a storm, and a buried stone had only begun to stitch together. It was she who suggested the cellar. If old survey papers existed anywhere on either property, she reasoned, they would be kept where a man might store what mattered most against fire and weather, not in a drawer that could be lost in a hasty evacuation, but underground, where the earth itself stood guard. Daniel led her down the narrow steps behind the cabin, past shelves of last year's preserves and a barrel of root vegetables gone soft at the edges, to the far wall where the stones had always seemed, to him, a little too carefully fitted. He had lit a lantern, and by its light they examined the wall the way they might have examined a stranger's face, looking for something familiar beneath the surface. It was Maeve's hand that found the loose stone, her fingers tracing a seam that didn't match the mortar around it. "Here," she said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only a kind of quiet certainty, as though she had known all along that the answer would not come from a surveyor's map, but from the house itself. Daniel worked the stone free with the flat of a trowel, and behind it, in a cavity no larger than a bread box, sat a tin container gone dull with age but otherwise untouched by damp or rot. He drew it out carefully, as a man might lift something sleeping, and set it on the shelf between them. The lid was sealed with wax, long since cracked and yellowed, and across the top, in handwriting neither of them recognized but both understood at once, were two names pressed close together as if they had always belonged in the same sentence: Hart and Callahan. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The lantern light moved faintly against the stone walls, and somewhere above them the wind still worried at the eaves, though the worst of the storm's fury had long since passed. Maeve looked at the box, then at Daniel, her arms no longer crossed but loose at her sides, as though the question of the railroad line had, for the moment, been set outside the cellar door. "You should open it," she said. "We should," he corrected, and something in the way he said it made her nod, slow and grave, as if she had been waiting, without knowing it, for him to say exactly that. He worked the wax free with the edge of his knife, patient as a man gentling a nervous horse, until the seal gave way and the lid lifted with a small, dry sigh, releasing air that had not moved in years. Inside lay a single folded letter, the paper gone soft and brown at its creases, addressed in the same joined hand to the same joined names. Daniel held it a moment without opening it, feeling the weight of it far beyond its thin paper, and glanced at Maeve, whose eyes had gone bright and unreadable in the lantern's glow. "Whatever it says," she murmured, "it was meant for both of us." "It still is," he answered, and together, without further ceremony, they unfolded it toward the light. The handwriting inside was smaller than on the envelope, hurried in places, as though the writer had feared running out of either time or courage before he finished. He read it once silently, his lips moving over certain words without sound, and then, because she was watching him with a stillness that asked more than her voice could, he read it aloud. It was written in his father's hand, though it bore both fathers' names at the bottom, as if each man had wanted to be sure the other's intent survived him. The letter spoke plainly of two friends who had ridden into this valley together before either had a wife or a child to his name, who had staked their claims side by side, not by accident but by design, meaning from the first survey stake that the land should someday be one holding rather than two. It spoke of a dry summer and a hard winter that had taught them both the same lesson, that a single family working one good stretch of river bottom would outlast two families each straining against a boundary line drawn only on paper. And it spoke, near the end, of a hope neither man had lived to see fulfilled, that a son and a daughter, grown to see reason where their fathers had only seen it in each other, might finish what two friendships and one dream of land had begun. He lowered the page slowly. The lantern hissed once and steadied. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and in the quiet the cellar seemed smaller than it had been, its earthen walls pressing closer around a silence that had waited 20 years to be spoken into. Maeve was the one who broke it, though her voice, when it came, was not soft. "They meant to arrange it," she said, "the way a man arranges a trade of cattle." She did not look at him now, but at the tin box, as though it had betrayed her by containing exactly what it contained. "And I have a letter of my own," she went on, "sitting folded in my apron pocket since yesterday, offering me a desk in Helena and a wage of my own earning, owed to no one's plan but mine." He said nothing at first, only watched the way her jaw had set, the way pride and hurt moved across her face almost too quickly to be read separately. "No one's holding you to their plan," he said finally, careful with each word. "Not your father's, and not mine." "No," she agreed, though the word came out uncertain. "No one is holding me." She folded her arms again, not in anger this time, but as if to keep something inside her chest from spilling loose too soon, and turned toward the cellar stairs, the letter still trembling faintly in her hand as she climbed toward the gray light of morning. For 3 days she did not speak of the letter again, and he did not ask. He had learned, in the weeks since the flood, that pressing her was the surest way to close a door already half open. So instead, he did the only thing that felt honest to him. He walked down to the river each morning with his axe and a coil of rope, and began, plank by plank, to rebuild what the storm had taken. He worked alone. He did not ask for her help, and though she watched him from her porch some mornings, arms crossed against the chill, she did not offer it either. There was a kind of truce in that distance, an understanding neither of them spoke aloud, that whatever she decided, it would not be decided for her, not by a dead man's plan, nor a live man's hope. The bridge came together slowly. He felled 2 young cottonwoods from the stand near the property line, squared the timbers by lantern light in the evenings, and hauled them down to the washed-out crossing on the sledge, one at a time, so as not to strain the horse past its limit. His hands blistered, then calloused. He measured twice before every cut, the way his father had taught him, and tried not to think too hard about why this particular bridge mattered more than any repair he'd made before. Maeve, meanwhile, carried the Helena letter with her the way some women carried a locket, folded small, tucked close, taken out and read again in private moments when she thought no one watched. She walked the fence line behind her cabin more than usual that week and stood a long while at the boundary marker, now fully uncovered, its old carved letters plain in the autumn light. She did not go to him. She did not go to town either, where the surveyor's man waited on an answer that would make one of them prosperous and the other poor by comparison. One evening she saw Daniel from a distance, waist deep in the shallows, wrestling a crossbeam into place against the current, his shirt soaked through and his breath fogging in the cooling air. She did not go down to help. She only watched, long enough that the cold made her fingers ache around the folded letter in her pocket, and then she turned back toward her own dark cabin without a word. That night she lay awake, running the sums of her life like a woman counting coin. The wage in Helena, the desk that would be hers alone, owed to no plan but her choosing. And beside those sums, unbidden, the sound of an axe striking wood at dawn, day after day, for no reward he had asked her to promise him. She rose before light, dressed, and walked to the window. Down at the river, faint in the gray, she could already see him there, alone, laying another plank across the gap between what had been broken and what might yet be whole again. The trunk was packed by mid-morning, corners tied with twine, her father's old ledger wrapped in cloth on top. She had meant to leave without seeing him, thinking it kinder to both of them, but the road to town ran past the river, and there was no way around what waited there. The bridge stood finished. Not the crude thing that had once spanned the water, but something sturdier, new planks pale against the weathered posts, rails fitted along both sides, the whole structure set higher than before, as if he had built it to outlast any storm that might come again. She stopped the wagon at the near bank and simply looked at it, the wood still raw and fragrant, nails catching the early light. He was standing at the far end, hat in hand, as though he had known she would come this way and had been waiting since dawn. She climbed down and crossed to him, her boots sounding hollow and sure on boards that had not existed a season ago. "You finished it," she said. Seemed a poor thing to leave half done. He turned the hat once in his hands. A man ought to finish what he starts, even if it isn't asked of him. She looked past him toward the two homesteads, hers to the west, his beside it, the boundary marker somewhere below the grass where the river had first uncovered it. "I have a place waiting in Helena. I know it. A desk, a wage that's mine. I know that too." He met her eyes then, steady, without pleading in it. "I'm not asking you to give up a life you've earned, Maeve. I'm asking if the one you want might be here instead, not as a neighbor across a fence line. As a wife, if you'll have me, so what our fathers meant to build might finally stand, the way they meant it to." The wind moved through the grass along the bank, and somewhere behind her, a horse stamped in its traces, patient, waiting on her answer as much as he was. She thought of the ledger sums she had counted in the dark, and how none of them had accounted for a man laying planks alone in the cold, for no promise but his own conviction. "Yes," she said, simply, the way she said most true things. "I'll stay." They were married in Silver Hollow before the last leaves fell, in a small service witnessed by neighbors who remembered both fathers well enough to weep a little at the fittingness of it. Afterward, the two land claims were recorded as one, the old boundary stone left standing where the flood had found it. No longer a line dividing, but a marker of where two families had finally become one. That winter, smoke rose from a single set of chimneys across land that had waited a generation to be whole, and the bridge he had built held firm against every storm that followed, carrying them both, together, wherever they needed to